Good morning, everyone. My name is Rhonda Moore. I'm a practice lead in science and innovation with the Institute on Governance, the IOG. I'm delighted to officially welcome you to the third session in our Driving Dialogue and Debate series. Our theme today and tomorrow is Western alienation. I have a few housekeeping notes, and then I will turn the microphone over to my colleague Brad Graham, who will moderate our session this morning. So first, just a note to let you know we're running this event until about 11:15 without a break. For those who are new to Microsoft Office platform or the Microsoft Office Teams platform, I'll just review a couple of basics. When you scroll across the middle of your screen, a menu bar should appear. On the menu bar, you'll see that you have the ability to turn on and off your video and mute your audio. And we ask that you do mute yourself for the duration of the event this morning. There will be a Q&A portion after the discussion, and we will collect your questions from the chat function. You're welcome to turn your video on or off as you prefer. You have the ability to pin participants. Doing so will ensure they remain on your screen for the duration of the event. So we would recommend that you pin our moderator, Brad Graham, and our two discussants, Don Lenehan and Dr. Lisa Young. So they will always be on your screen. To pin someone, in the menu bar, you go to the list of participants, which is the two-person icon on the main menu bar, and you click on that, and then a list of participants should display on the right side of your screen. When you hover your cursor over an individual's name, you see three little dots, and if you click on these dots, to pin someone is one of the options that will appear. For some, you might only be able to pin one person, but if that's the case, don't worry. Whoever is speaking will automatically appear on your screen, as I expect I am there now. There will be a Q&A at the end of the debate, as I mentioned, and we'll collect your questions from the chat function. So please submit them there as they occur to you. We'll be monitoring them throughout the discussion and putting them into a queue. And then, of course, when you're ready to leave the event at 11:15, you just click on the red telephone button, and that will end the meeting for you. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you from Ottawa, from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. We offer land acknowledgements to demonstrate respect for the traditional Indigenous custodians of the region in which we meet. In a virtual setting such as this, we are coming together from communities across Canada. Many of our communities are situated on treaty land that is steeped in rich Indigenous history and home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. Hundreds of years after the first treaties were signed, they are still relevant today. I would now like to introduce the IOG team. With us this morning are Laura Edgar, Vice President of the IOG, who is our executive producer of this event. Jason Landry is our IT support, and they're both on standby if you have any questions, if you're having any difficulty. Don Lenehan, one of our discussants, is an IOG associate and an expert in public deliberation. Brad Graham, VP Toronto, will be our moderator this morning. Of course, none of this would have been possible without the support of our financial sponsors. The Institute on Governance would like to thank the Privy Council Office, Infrastructure Canada, Immigration, Refugee and Citizenship Canada, and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada for their contribution to the series. L'Institut sur la gouvernance tient à remercier le Bureau du Conseil privé, Infrastructure Canada, Immigration, Réfugiés et Citoyenneté Canada, Agriculture et Agroalimentaire Canada pour leur contribution à cette série. Brad, over to you.
Thank you, Rhonda, and good morning, everyone. And again, welcome to the Institute on Governance's Dialogue and Debate series. As Rhonda mentioned, my name is Brad Graham, and I'll be your host and moderator for this morning. And as a reminder, and as you know, the Dialogue and Debate series is designed to raise policy issues where, conventional public debate is failing to produce solutions. Or as in the case of today's topic, Western alienation, where a multitude of policy debates and institutional arrangements have led to a bit of a fraying of our Canadian fabric. The series tries to promote a path to engage in debates in a way to find a way forward to develop shared narratives with the hope of leading to more accepted and supported solutions. As you know, We are confronted daily with many debates on issues critical to Canada, and it's fair to say it's become a polarized debate, which makes agreement difficult. This is a particular challenge for the government and for the public service as they try to find answers to complex problems. Now, in this series, we explore 4 divisive issues, which included our inaugural immigration session, last session's climate change and the economy, and today's topic, Western alienation. We will conclude this series on July 21st and 2nd with a debate and discussion of political divisiveness and a polarized electorate. Now, each of these 4 sessions begins with a bit of a debate, and we should be clear that these are not conventional policy debates, but we'll use these sessions to look at issues and examine the key assumptions and values that are being advanced through the narratives, and then consider if there's a common ground that may allow us to build a shared narrative. And I must say, today's session is quite timely. Alberta's Fair Deal panel submitted its report to Premier Jason Kenney on May 16th, and the Alberta government released its response to the report on June 17th. It is also particularly timely as Premier Kenney is set to announce the first part of a major economic strategy later today. Now, while it's expected to address the slumping energy sector, it is also reported to include diversification strategies to move more into information technology in the digital world, and it's being billed as a major strategy. And while it will be an economic strategy, I suspect it will say more. It'll be interesting to see if the Premier puts forward a new or expanded narrative for Alberta. For today's session, we'll explore how a Western alienation narrative was developed through the Kenney process, the panel process, and ask the question, is the resulting narrative sufficient to solve the Western alienation issue? Or is there a path to a new narrative for the West and indeed Canada? Now, as I mentioned at the outset, this is not a traditional debate. However, we do have some structure, and I'll just spend a few moments going through the iambic pentameter of the day. In a moment, I'll offer some thoughts to provide a bit of a context for the discussion, and then I will introduce you to Lisa and Dawn, our 2 discussants. Afterward, I'll ask Dawn and Lisa to provide opening statements of about 4 to 5 minutes in length. And after that, I will ask a few questions of Lisa and Dawn, and where appropriate, invite them to respond to one another's comments. And then we'll turn questions over to the floor for about 20 minutes or perhaps more. And again, as Rhonda mentioned, I would ask that you write your questions in the chat functions, and I'll let you know, I'll take the liberty of perhaps combining some questions to ensure we raise as many points and perspectives and questions as possible during our time. And then at about 11 o'clock, I'll ask Dawn and Lisa to provide 2 minutes of closing remarks to put a bow and reflection on what we've debated and discussed. But first, some context from my perspective, and I'll try to be objective, but when you're exploring why a region may feel alienated, it's difficult to do so without viewing the issue from their perspective. The topic this morning, Western alienation, is certainly a divisive issue for Canada, and by its very nature and definitionally, regional alienation will be felt differently in different parts of the country. Clearly, it's felt strongly in the West, particularly in Alberta and Saskatchewan. However, I'll venture to say that it is less appreciated in Ontario, where I sit, and Quebec, and in particular Toronto, Ottawa, and Quebec City, which of course tends to add to the sense of alienation. Now, there are many causes for this sense of alienation. I mean, it's historic, from Sir John A.'s national plan, which we also felt, by the way, in my native Nova Scotia, to the 1880s freight rates, to the 1980s National Energy Program. There's lots of examples where national policies seem to be in conflict with the views and aspirations of the West. It's also demographic. The population of the West is only half that of Ontario and Quebec. Now, as a result of those demographics, Ontario and Quebec control 199 of 338 seats in Parliament. And in Canada, there is no real effective counterbalance for regions, unlike the United States, where each state, regardless of population, is represented by 2 senators in the more powerful of the 2 parts of Congress. Now, I'm not going to get into a 3E Senate debate here, but you can see where other jurisdictions have built a bit of a counterbalance for regions, which may not be as present in Canada. It's also about geography. The West is far from Ottawa. It also has a unique rural-urban split and culture that, despite rapid and continuous urbanization in Canada, still permeates the region today. And it's economic and fiscal. The West, with its rich oil and natural resources, have, until recently, fueled much of the Canadian economy. Alberta, in particular, sees itself as having bankrolled a significant amount of national initiatives, not the least of which is equalization, which Alberta feels particularly hard done by. And I think, to make matters worse, as the Western economy is recently in decline, there's a sentiment that they are not being as helped as much as other regions when faced with similar economic circumstances. You will recall the financial support for the auto industry in Ontario during the financial meltdown. And cumulatively, it's about policy and government decision-making. Recently, a combination of carbon tax, failure to get pipelines built, and new requirements on environmental assessment seems to have caused a bit of a tipping point. And that was manifest in the most recent federal election, where the Conservative Party took 33 of Alberta's 34 seats and all of 14 seats in Saskatchewan. Now, here's an important point, I think. You may disagree with the reasons the West feels alienated. That's fair game. I mean, we could go down the list of Western grievances and have very legitimate debates on each and every one. For example, is the current equalization formula fair? Whether or not we have an optimal energy strategy given our priority to fight climate change, or whether interprovincial trade barriers are justified. We could have those debates and we could theoretically knock down every one. But one thing we can't argue is that the West feels alienated. This is real, it exists, and it's measurable. For example, according to Ipsos, more than 6 in 10 residents of Alberta, 65%, and Saskatchewan agree with the statement that, quote, "my province does not get its fair share from Confederation." Now, there's also rising support for separation in both provinces. 1/3 of Albertans and slightly more than 1/4 of Saskatchewan residents agree with the statement that my province would be better off if it's separated from Canada. Now, a belief that Alberta would be better off if it's separated is up 8 points from just over a year ago, and a belief that Saskatchewan would be better off if it's separated is up 9 points from just a year ago. Now, when we were reviewing these statistics with Mike College of Ipsos, I think we both came to the conclusion that how you feel about the reality of Wexit or whether separation is a reality, I think many people are discounting that, justifiably so in the short term, but we can't ignore those statistics. Those are real. If you will, they are the 11 on the speaker volume button in terms of alienation and dissatisfaction. Which brings us to the recently released Fair Deal panel report. After extensive public and expert consultations, the panel released its report, or gave it to Premier Kenney, in May, and the government of Alberta released its response on June 17th. Now, it's interesting, and I suppose perhaps not surprising, that the very first 2 sentences of the executive summary cuts right to the chase. And I'll quote, a substantial majority of Albertans do not believe that they are receiving a fair deal from the federal government. Many are angry and want the government of Alberta to reassert its position in Confederation and minimize Ottawa's overreach. Now, I'm not going to review all the recommendations here. You were sent the link, and it's up on their website. But we will use the panel's process and recommendations as a bit of a base for discussion. Among many issues, we'd like to explore several issues and questions, such as, does the panel process and report construct a narrative that will address Western alienation? Importantly, how should the rest of Canada address it? And is it possible to develop a shared narrative? And importantly, what are the implications if we do not? Finally, I would like to add, also like to observe that while Western alienation is a bit historic in its roots and duration, we are also currently in a world of declining social cohesion and increased polarization. Do we or should we pay special attention given this environment? And an important question is, what are the risks and implications if we do not? Well, there is a lot to dissect and discuss here, and we are lucky to have two great discussions to do just that. First of all, it's my pleasure to introduce Don Lanahan. Don is an associate of the Institute on Governance and is an internationally recognized expert on public engagement, accountability, and governance. And a little known fact about Don: he grew up in Alberta and obtained his BA in British Columbia. So he will bring his most formative years being alienated to this debate. And it's a special pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Lisa Young. Lisa Young is professor of political science at the University of Calgary and the director of graduate programs at the School of Public Policy. Dr. Young has published extensively in the field of Canadian politics with several books, including Rebuilding Canadian Party Politics, Feminists and Party Politics, and Advocacy Groups. Now, I will turn and ask each of the discussants to provide an opening statement of about 4 to 5 minutes, and I will be timing. And first off, Don, good morning. Can I ask you to begin?
Thanks very much, Brad, and good morning to everyone out there. I'm delighted to be back again and glad to see, or sort of see, those of you from who were at the earlier sessions and those of you who are new. So, this is the third of 4 sessions that IOG is hosting. Each one focuses on a difficult and divisive issue: immigration, climate versus economy, and now Western alienation. We've been using these sessions to explore the role that narrative plays in these conflicts and that narrative building can play in resolving them. Take the Western alienation narrative. It says that since the early days of Confederation, Central Canada has used its majority in the House of Commons to exploit the West. For Alberta, the defining moment was 1982 with Pierre Trudeau's National Energy Program. Basically, the Liberals used their majority in Parliament to guarantee cheap oil for Central Canada. 40 years later, the battles over pipelines, the carbon tax, are still filtered through this lens. Indeed, today, many Albertans are convinced that Justin Trudeau really wants to kill the oil industry to meet his goals on climate change. Here's my question for today. Could Alberta and Canada build a shared narrative that puts their relationship in a more positive light and leaves the old alienation narrative behind? A lot of smart people think not. The two sides, they say, would never find enough common ground. They're just too far apart. The alienation narrative is entrenched, and Ottawa's challenge is to live with it. I think there's room for more optimism. In fact, a powerful new counter-narrative is already reshaping how we see every region of this country, and Alberta is at the epicenter. That narrative is about climate change. The world, we are told, is hurtling toward global catastrophe, and to save it, we must shift to renewable energy. Activists have singled out the oil sands as a symbol of everything that is wrong with hydrocarbons. A decade ago, Albertans' reaction was a combination of outrage, denial, and defiance. But as the evidence mounts and the climate narrative takes root, the mood is changing. Albertans may be mad as hell, but they're also scared. The writing is on the wall, and they need a new vision for the future. There is some very encouraging news. Big multinationals in the oil patch are rapidly changing their narrative. These companies now acknowledge that greenhouse gas emissions must be stopped. They recognize that a transition to a sustainable economy is inevitable. Rather than resisting change, the industry is repositioning itself as an agent of change. In this view, the oil and gas sector have a critical role to play in Canada's transition to a sustainable economy. This will come through new technologies, carbon capture, renewable fuels, and much more. Climate change activists are skeptical at best. So far, there is no agreement on how this transition will work, and there are sharp disagreements over how fast it should be, how it should be planned, and how it should be financed. Industry's transition talk, say the activists, is too little too late, a last gasp from a dying industry that is desperate to buy legitimacy. I don't know who is right. Perhaps the gap here is unbridgeable, but I don't think anyone knows for sure whether a workable transition plan can be found until we give it a try. And for that, we must look to our political leaders. So far, the signs are not encouraging. Canadians, on the other hand, want progress. Polls tell us that a majority in every region say they believe that the oil and gas industry can be aligned with our goals on climate change, and they want to see this happen. This is where narrative building comes in. Ottawa and Alberta have a mutual interest in forging a credible story about the transition to a sustainable economy, one that includes Alberta. Without this, alienation is likely to assume a new and even more belligerent form, and the country could find itself more deeply divided than ever. So, my point is that the narrative in Alberta is not locked in. It can be changed. Indeed, it's already changing. A window is opening in which Albertans and Canadians could create a shared vision for the future. Will our leaders rise to the occasion? Canadians are watching and waiting. Thanks.
Great, Don. Thank you for that great setup for this morning. And now it is my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Lisa Young, who will provide 4 to 5 minutes of her opening remarks.
Well, thanks very much for that. I have lived in Alberta for 23 years now, and I think it's my job at some level to give a little bit of a sense of what things are like on the ground. And I would have to say that, I'm by no stretch of the imagination representative of some of the views that have animated the Fair Deal panel. I've been a critic for a long time of some of the notions of Alberta alienation in the way that they manifest. But I think it's really important to give people elsewhere in the country a bit of a feel for how things are in Alberta, and particularly Calgary and Southern Alberta right now. And I'm not sure if the slide that I had prepared is up for people to look at. If it is, it may not be. What I wanted to show you were 3 pictures. There we go. 3 pictures that my son took when he and his father were driving out of Alberta to head off to university last fall. And this was a convoy of pickup trucks and SUVs, flying flags of Saskatchewan, of Alberta, with some rude words about the Prime Minister, with decals about not disarming Canadians, talking about government accountability. And while we don't see these kinds of things every day in Alberta, we certainly do see these kinds of manifestations of alienation, and I would even say rage from time to time. And I think that when we're thinking about this question of whether there can be a shared narrative, what has to be taken into account is the character of the movement that has emerged, that is expressing, I think, fear, but also rage about the decline of an industry that has given Alberta a great deal. A sense that Alberta has not had a fair deal within Confederation, historically, but even more recently. And I think that there are some key ingredients to this that we need to take into account. Certainly, there's the historical grievance that both of the previous speakers have talked about. But added into this is a sense of partisan identity. And I think we need to take seriously the notion that there's a partisan identity here, that Alberta's interests are coincident with conservative interests. And so part of what we've seen in the past 20 or 25 years has been a sense that Alberta's alienation is much greater when their party isn't in power. So I recently published something in Policy Options where I talked about, this sense that partisanship and electoral success were really key to understanding the sense of grievance. If we look back to the firewall letter in 2001 after the election outcome, and then the reinvigoration of the so-called Wexit movement after the most recent election. And I think we can't dismiss the importance of partisanship here. And just like other places in the world, partisanship is increasingly coming to structure people's views of the world and of reality. So I think that's one of the significant barriers that have to be faced when we think about what's going on now. I'm going to close just by leaving with one thought, that if we want to understand the alienation of a relatively affluent place like Alberta, I think we need to understand the sense that at some level, that on the one hand, Alberta is a relatively small population relative to the rest of the country, but there's a sense that plays into the debate about alienation or the discussion of alienation that because we're paying more through our taxes, we ought to have more influence. And again, this factors into the notion of partisan identity and the idea that when Alberta can't contribute to deciding in the way that it sees fit to deciding who would govern and how we'll be governed, we should take what we're contributing, those dollars, and pull back. And I think that's a critical piece, together with the sense of threat and economic crisis at the moment, that have brought us to the place where we have, I think, in a small group of people who are quite serious about pursuing independence, but a much larger group of people who really have come to believe that Alberta's troubles are not of our own making, but rather of our involvement in Confederation.
Okay, thank you very much from that, Lisa. Now I'll turn to the portion, the Q&A portion of the program and session. I will ask each discussant in turn, and then you can take a couple of minutes to respond. I will keep a time watch, and I may ask you to wrap up an answer, and I may even use my old teacher's bell, which I think people might be able to hear. But if you're onto something, I'll let it go. I think we have rules, but I'm sure you will be mindful of your time. Dawn, let me start with you. Can I ask you yourself, how do you understand that the Western alienation narrative? And perhaps importantly, what should Canadians from different regions make of it? And I guess underlying this is the Western view of Confederation a fair view?
Well, let me say, I mean, having grown up in the West and spent my formative years there, as you pointed out, do I think that this is let's call it a fair view of Confederation or an accurate view? At one level, absolutely. Like, do I think that the West has been screwed? Yes, frankly, I do, actually. And I don't think it's hard to make that case. We can go back and we can look at a number of the examples that we have brought up along the way, whether it's back to John A. Macdonald or Pierre Trudeau's national energy policy or something else. But there are, I think, a number of cases where there is a serious history of unfairness. I think, and the bigger question here, there's two things. One is the idea that this is about an imbalance in power, the majority that Central Canada enjoys in the House of Commons. There's no simple way to change that. And without getting into the stuff about reforming the Senate, we all know where that leads. It opens up the Constitution, and that's just not about to happen as far as I know. So there is a question of whether or not one group of people with a huge imbalance in power is likely to use it to further their interests, and the answer is yes. So I guess having said that, what I also want to say is Canada is a federation, and we've made room for differences, and there are lots of opportunities for the West, Alberta in particular, to develop and express its difference, just as Quebec does and the Atlantic region does, and so on. And I think the price we often pay for that is a growing expectation that autonomy is sort of the primary thing, and if we don't have enough of it, we should get more of it. So I guess if I could sort of come to the point here, what I really want to say is I think there are some serious injustices or unfairnesses that need to be addressed. But I think increasingly there's an unwillingness to see this in light of what's on the other side and what are our expectations and what are our responsibilities as members of the Federation. And I think that question of how you have a fair discussion about what really and genuinely are fair grievances is kind of got lost. It's now about autonomy for a lot of people in the West. And I would allude to what Lisa had said here about even further kind of conflating that with a conservative identity. It makes it really hard to sit back and say what things are fair and unfair. I just want to add one last thing here before I stop. I think where we really see this getting muddied now is in the environment. It's perfectly legitimate for the rest of Canada to have views on climate change and the environment and the future. And those are policy differences that in the context of democracy, there's a fair debate to be had. The fact that it may have some impact on the West and on Alberta in particular is not a reason to decide that it's unfair. And I think that's a conversation we're having a really hard time having.
Okay, thanks, Don. Lisa, you tried to explain the Western alienation narrative to non-Westerners. But just to pick up on a point that Don raised and was in the initial question, I mean, how should Canadians from other regions in Canada interpret this narrative and what to do with it, if you will? As I mentioned in a bit of my context, yes, we can go through every file and say, look, I disagree here and here's some points, et cetera, et cetera. But cumulatively, it's an issue. And as Don just mentioned, we are in a federation. So how do we square that? In other words, yes, we can feel good in Central Canada about quote unquote winning every debate, either by our intellectual prowess or the mere mathematics of confederation. What do you think other regions should be hearing, and what should we do about that?
I think that the crux of the articulation of alienation right now is twofold. The first is the idea that Albertan taxpayers' dollars go to Ottawa, where the government will use that money to placate Quebec, right? I mean, that's as clear a statement of the critique as I can make. And it's not a view that I endorse, but I think that we need to understand it. And then you add insult to injury that on top of taking this money and using it to stay in power and placate Quebec, and the stay in power part is a critique of the Liberals, that there's no help for keeping the money going, right? That there's no help with building pipelines, that that the Alberta project is being hindered in a variety of ways. So what do you do with that, right? I mean, how does the rest of the country respond to that? Is this regional alienation, or is it a tax revolt? That's the first question. So this is very much the stuff of partisan politics. What kinds of taxes should we pay? How should we share? I think a conversation about it, increasing public knowledge about, exactly what the equalization formula is and how it plays out might be helpful. But beyond this, I think it presents an enormous challenge to the rest of the country, because the sense, it is an assertion that if we contribute fundamentally to the well-being, the economic wealth of the country, then our interests should trump other interests, right? That we can't have concerns about pipelines. We can't talk about climate change because that gets in the way. And so finding some kind of a middle ground and trying to understand, this isn't old-fashioned regional alienation. This is something different, and it is tied up in these notions of partisanship and it's about money. Yeah.
Actually, can I just jump in for a sec, Brad?
Please, Don.
I think this raises a really interesting question, and for me a difficult one, is that Kenny has called for a referendum now on equalization. There will be one in 2021, I guess it is, and it's interesting because there are, I think there's legitimate arguments to be had about equalization, and I think that Alberta is perfectly right to bring these to the table. But in fact, holding a referendum on equalization isn't really on equalization or just, it's on Section 36 of the Constitution, in which the principle of equality of opportunity is embedded. Some of us regard that as an achievement of the 1982 Constitution. I think opening up the discussion in a referendum in Alberta under the guise of equalization that will be in fact about a fundamental challenging or a challenging of a fundamental principle in the Constitution that a whole bunch of other Canadians and people in Alberta for that matter will see as part of what the Federation is about, I think does raise some serious questions. And I mean, again, I appreciate that there's they can't get at some of the questions they want to get at, but I think it does raise the question, what's going on here? Are we going to have the right discussion, and are we just putting ourselves at odds with a whole bunch of other people in Confederation that are going to make the discussion worse? In a nutshell, to go back to Lisa's point again, we're mixing up an ideology here, I think, with some legitimate questions.
Okay, let me go down that path a bit, Don. We went through the kind of list of grievances and policies that may be at odds, and the sense of alienation, and indeed, some of this may be run hotter or colder depending upon who's in power in Ottawa. But if you were to sit back a bit and take a look at the measures and initiatives that have been introduced historically at the federal government and more recently, can you objectively take a look at those policies and answer the question, is the West treated unfairly?
Well, I guess to repeat what I said earlier, I think at times it has been and at times it is. I think the problem is, again, it's parsing what the reasonable expectations are as a member of the Federation and as somebody with a strong regional identity. And I think some things, we've had this discussion with Quebec, right? I think there are serious questions about the extent to which regional autonomy should be allowed and people should be able to develop independent identities and follow different kinds of policies and so on. And by the way, policies are going to get followed within the Federation in any event. But I think there is another question, and this is where I think the narrative does come in. When you start deciding, if you start deciding that anything that offends against the regional view and in some sense your autonomy, then is not legitimate. And I think, maybe I'm repeating myself, I think the hard question here is how do we parse what are legitimate questions from ones that are increasingly questions about potentially an identity of a certain sort or a set of values. And I think the only way we can do that is if we get a conversation going in which people on both sides are willing to take a step to the other side and say, what's it like to be inside your head? What's it like to be a Canadian outside of Alberta? What's it like to be an Albertan inside Alberta? And I think we're doing that worse. We're worse and worse at that. So I think there's a serious question, but I'd want to say it's not so much whether a specific policy is good or bad. It's how do we get that dialogue going where we can have a constructive exchange about what's a genuine grievance and what is not. And I think that's imperiled.
Okay, thanks, Don. And Lisa, over to you on that. Yes, and particularly when you look at the Fair Panel report, it almost reads like a grievance of balance of payments or terms of trade. And I get it, it may come off as a bit of accounting. And yes, we could have a discussion on equalization, but I'm sure that will deaden anyone's enthusiasm for debate if we start getting into the minutiae of the formula. But having said that, as an Albertan, through your own personal view or observation, do you think there's an inherent bias in policies of national policies and how we treat the West, or no?
I mean, I think that if we look historically, certainly we can point to lots of instances. And, one of the fundamental dilemmas for Western Canada writ large is about demographics, right? That you've got enormous amounts of space, you've got enormous, natural resource wealth, and relatively small populations. Now that's changing as BC and Alberta have grown, but there's this critique of democratic institutions because Alberta will only ever have so many seats in the House of Commons relative to the enormous numbers in Ontario and Quebec. The endless complaint that, elections are decided long before the polls close in Western Canada, although the poll closing times have changed. But there is this sense of not being able to direct the country. And that's where we see the preoccupation with, the mechanisms of intrastate federalism, why we're, there's there's this notion of, that Senate reform would change things. If you read the whole Fair Deal panel report, you'll see, a lot of what's essentially the Reform Party platform from the late 1990s, talking about how the West wants in and the West wants to reshape Confederation so that voices are heard more. Is there something to that? Yes. On the other hand, if you live in a democracy, numbers do matter. So I think that finding a balance between those things and finding a space to have these sorts of conversations and focusing in on the policy questions. And I think one of the reasons why this moment feels so dangerous is that the policy shift isn't about who, gets to control the development of natural resources. It's about climate change policy. And at the moment where there's this sort of sense of existential threat to this industry that's so deeply tied to the identity of the province.
Okay, great. Thank you, Lisa. That kind of leads nicely into my next question. No one's arguing, or at least what I'm saying is not to say we should water down our commitment to climate change to accommodate a region. But given the kind of historic list of grievances and the extent of alienation, does Ottawa and Canada as a whole have a duty to act, if you will? I mean, it's not like Saskatchewan and Alberta are having a bad day in Confederation. I mean, so do we have to move ourselves up one level from each individual file and have a shared narrative with Alberta?
Is that for me?
Yes, Don, sorry.
My short answer is yes. Yeah, and I guess, well, I wouldn't want to be naive about the sort of go back to my, I'm sorry, I keep hearing a beeping here. I'm not sure if that's myself or something else.
Let me see if it might be me. Hold on. Go ahead, Don.
Anyway, my apologies. I'm just going to say that to go back to my opening comments, I think there is a serious there's an opportunity, I guess, in the climate change narrative. I don't know how far this can take us. I think what we do know, it's gone far enough that we realize there is a potential meeting of minds, at least in the abstract, on the idea of a transition to a sustainable economy. And I regard that as huge progress in Alberta. If that is surfacing, it means that the possibility of changing the narrative really is there. Or I shouldn't say really is there. There's the possibility and there's an opening. I think it should be incumbent on the federal government looking ahead to realize that if there isn't some kind of progress on this, that if we don't take advantage of this, things are likely to get worse, not better. So should it take an important step in that direction and try to open up some kind of a conversation? I don't know quite what that would look like. I have some ideas, but my answer is yes. And I think this takes me back to the original point. It's not just enough to have a discussion on whether or not some powers or programs should be patriated to Alberta. Maybe we'll come to that when we can discuss it. My view is that while I'm not necessarily opposed to that, I don't think that's going to solve the problem. I think the problem is deeper. It's our ability to have an informed conversation about what is appropriate and fair. And until we get over the narrative that's separating us, that's driving us apart, that's polarizing us, that's going to get worse, not better. So my short answer is we ought to see this as an opportunity to explore the possibility of changing that relationship. And maybe we'll succeed and maybe we will not, but we should try. We being at least the federal government. I'm sorry, I'm just going to check. I think that is something going on in my house. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, I think it is.
I was checking my my fire alarms as well, and I don't seem to see it. Maybe that's kind of metaphoric. I don't know. Lisa, what do you think? Given the fact that there is, historic and widespread alienation, that there is, is Ottawa and the rest of Canada, are we incumbent to kind of take that into consideration? And again, you raise the issue of partisanship and the mathematics of democracy, and we get that. But, coming back to, we are a federation, we are a family, and if one is feeling aggrieved, we at least have to take that into account. So even though we are, if you will, winning a battle on policy, how we wage that and what kind of discussions we have, is there room for Ottawa and the rest of Canada to improve?
Yeah, and I think there's two things here, and I want to respond to something that Dawn said while you were checking your fire detectors or smoke detectors. But I'll answer your question first about the sort of the obligation to take seriously. And I think absolutely there is, right? I mean, if we know nothing else as a country, it is that a region that feels a sense of persistent alienation or grievance can really dominate politics for a long period of time. And, you know, if you think about the challenges that Canada and every other country are going to face as we come out of the crisis that we're in right now, you know, do we want to be spending our time dealing with separatist movements in Western Canada? Absolutely not. You know, there's an important role to play here in taking this seriously. And I would add to that I think it's really incumbent on the rest of the country, even if you don't take seriously the gist of the claims coming out of Alberta. And I think there's in some ways, you know, good reason not to dig deep and find a sense of empathy for a province that is facing this existential threat. You know, I think there are elements in the province that are acting out in strange and unacceptable ways as a result of that. But do understand this as the loss of a way of life, and that's significant. And you can't understand what's going on in Alberta if you don't sort of try to understand that, you know, people are losing the things that they expected, you know, about how they would likely live their lives. But now that Dawn's back, I'm going to add in, I just wanted to say something about, you know, where there's ground for, you know, some where there's common ground. And Dawn is pointing to polling data that demonstrates that there is a, you know, a growing sense in Alberta among the public that climate change is real, that we need to address this, that this is in fact an important public policy issue. And here's one of the moments where talking over the heads of government to people is perhaps the critical way to go about doing this, because the attitudes and the opinions in the general public in Alberta are perhaps more amenable to this conversation than are the government views, particularly at the moment. And, you know, one of the real dilemmas to having this conversation at a government to government level is the extent to which the current government has really doubled down on the notion that, you know, oil and gas are viable, that any attempt to deal with climate change is an attempt to attack Alberta, you know, spending millions of dollars, public dollars, asserting the idea that, you know, we produce ethical oil and gas. And this government is going to be a difficult government to work with and to find common ground with on the climate change file.
Brad, I'm just going to intervene for a second. My apologies here, folks. My apologies to you folks out there. Is I have a fire thing that keeps going off and I can't stop it. So I'm just going to keep myself muted except for when I speak. My sincere apologies, folks. I have nobody else in the house to fix this right now.
Well, good on you for that. Let me pick up on that point, Lisa, and reorient Dawn to this issue a bit. And I think the point you raised about people talking to people is a good one, in the sense of, I think it's fair to say during the last election or lead up to the last election, and climate change was a prime example, and maybe this just speaks to political rhetoric writ large these days in Western democracies, but we have what we called at the IOG, the emergence of wedge solutions. In other words, you know, 86+% of Canadians not just want action on climate change, but real and substantive action on climate change. But when we come to debating that in a political forum, many ways the solutions or the policy proposals put forward in the platform become weaponized. In other words, you're either for carbon tax, or you were a denier, or you were for technology and regulation, or you were a tax and spend liberal. Both of those solutions aren't sufficient to deal with what we have to deal with, but yet we polarized and kind of weaponized that discussion a bit. And I'd like your reflections, maybe, is there a way forward where we can lift ourselves from the kind of the electoral discussion and have a kind of reasoned debate of trying to square the circle here? Don, maybe I'll start with you.
Yes, and once again, folks, I apologize if you get a little beep in there. I'm very sorry, but let me pick that up and ignore the sounds. I think a really important part of the solution to that problem, frankly, is got to come from outside of politics. And we sort of say, well, where does that take us? And it's interesting because for whatever reasons, you've alluded to some of these, Brad, the political discussion is increasingly polarized. And I think one of the arguments we've been making in this series is that the increasing understanding of how narrative works is a part of polarizing, is that communications people in the political world are discovering they can frame a narrative in a way that pushes the other side to the other side and forces them to take their own narrative. And then they force the middle ground to disappear. And people out there, the public, have to make a choice. Either you're with us or you're against us, right? Or you don't get into this discussion. So right now, if there is middle ground in the public's mind, there's nobody articulating that. And I think the way part of the task or part of the challenge for bringing this back together is to bring the public into that discussion in some structured and more reliable way. It's really interesting if you look at the terms of reference for the Fair Deal panel. The process is outlined in broad terms, and one of the things it calls for is a series of reference panels for citizens. Reference panels are highly structured, formal processes that involve citizens carefully chosen in a representative and fair way, and given facilitation and rules to follow for a structured debate. What that does is it gives them a lot of legitimacy. It creates a voice that, in fact, might articulate something in the middle and be articulated by a representative group of citizens. But here's the thing that's interesting is that perhaps this is because of COVID, but that's the one part of the mandate, the description in the terms of reference that wasn't acted on. So one of the things I would call for here is, what if we actually did design some other kinds of processes that got the public voice more focused, more articulate, and talking about that middle ground in a way that might bring the politicians back together and out of their corners. So I think that's one direction where there might be a solution.
Okay, thanks, Don. And I will get to a process question in a moment, but Lisa, I was wondering if you could comment on, do we at minimum have to take a little bit, I mean, I know you mentioned that it's a very partisan debate. Do we have to kind of de-escalate, if you will, the political narrative to have any hope at kind of an ongoing discussion and dialogue?
Absolutely. And I think in some ways the political narrative is the greatest obstacle here, right? The notion of blaming and finger pointing. And, it's been strange and troubling to watch some of that narrative take place in Alberta over the last couple of years, that, in the absence of really any evidence that, Alberta's troubles have been laid at the foot of the federal government, that this is all Trudeau's fault. And that obviously speaks to a historical narrative about earlier Trudeau. So I do think that finding a way past those sorts of political articulations of grievance and letting people really engage with the substance of the issues. And of course, one of the things that, is endlessly frustrating, I think, around the conversation around equalization is the lack of understanding of what equalization really is and how it plays out. And I think, there are members of the political elite who have tried to further polarize by talking about how Alberta gives money to other provinces, when of course it's not. It's taxpayers in Alberta who pay to the federal government, and those levels of misunderstanding. So I do think that where you can have citizen engagement that starts with shared factual understanding, it's certainly a step in the right direction.
Okay, great. And I'll just take this time in about 15 minutes or so, we'll open the floor for questions. I'd remind you, if you have a question, please write it out in the chat function, and then we'll get to that in a moment. So please, if you have anything sitting there burning questions, we'll get to them. Don, maybe I'll turn to you. We talked about, the origins and what's going on now and the need for a new narrative, and you touched on it a bit in your last response, but is there a specific process or dialogue, or is there some mechanism, how we talk to one another, but do we need to have some kind of structured conversation of shared narrative for Canada? And if so, who should lead it? Is the Kenny exercise a potential path forward? Do we need to engage as civil society? But we have to have some form other than hundreds of random op-eds. I mean, or do we? Don, I don't know if you have any views on that.
Yeah, I do indeed, and I guess I've outlined this in a very preliminary way, or a very sort of short way in the discussion paper. I certainly don't want to take issue with the Fair Deal panel, but I think that's not the kind of process that we need, or let's just say this, that's one kind of process. If we're looking for some way to actually find middle ground, in fact, let me take a step back, and people will hear about this tomorrow in their learning exercise. What we're not doing is we're not listening. Increasingly, we are not listening to the other side. And in some ways, folks, it's as simple as that and as hard as that, is until we actually sit down and have a conversation where I'm genuinely prepared again to listen to what you're saying and figure out what that means and how I can deal with that in a reasonable way. And that's going to require us thinking and listening and weighing evidence and so on. We're not going to make any serious progress. So I guess what I would say is that we need processes. We need some kind of process that not only brings citizens in because they're showing that they're looking for some kind of middle ground. We need a process that is facilitated and structured in a way that there are rules for them to follow that even help and force them to listen to one another. So if you sit down in a process, it's not enough that you just start talking and tell your point of view. You're not there to advocate. You're there to find solutions. That means we have to agree to rules like everybody gets to talk and nobody gets to dominate. You have to provide evidence for the claims that you make. You have to be willing to show some spirit for compromise. And I think we can design those processes. Here's what I would say is we can't leap into this and expect that we're going to find a solution to build a shared narrative. But we could start that conversation, and we could start it, I think, in fairly open ways. If it was up to the federal government, I would be saying, or the provincial government, if it could work with the provincial government on that, I would be saying that we should start, that if Jason Kenney's going to open up a discussion where he's going to start talking with the federal government at an intergovernmental level around that process or in parallel to that process should be a conversation that involves citizens. It doesn't have to be wide open, and it's got to be structured, but it would require a huge amount of money or effort. And I think the important thing here is it can't be just inside Alberta or just outside Alberta. I think it's got to be Albertans talking to people outside Alberta where they have a chance to exchange ideas about some very fundamental questions about what do you get out of Confederation? Why do you think it's different? Why do you think you need more autonomy? And they don't have to answer all those questions. I think they have to just start putting pressure on themselves and governments to start listening and actually finding some level of middle ground. And I want to say this again. I think the good news is that right now there's reason to look for middle ground, and there's a place to look for it. Around the changing economy, around climate change, around trying to find some way to make this work for Alberta and work for Canada. Can we get there? I don't know, but I think a process like that would be a big step in the right direction.
Okay, great. Thank you, Don. And we'll come back to that issue of rallying around climate change. I know a question has just come in from the audience in that regard, which I'll get to in a moment. Lisa, what do you think about a more formal process to discuss this issue? Do you think Kenny's Fair Deal panel was a step in the right direction? I do note, if I'm not mistaken, on the Fair Deal panel, they called for expanding Alberta's presence physically in Ottawa and elsewhere through a kind of diplomatic effort. Is it on Alberta to expand that conversation, or the West writ large, Saskatchewan and Alberta, to initiate that discussion with the rest of Canada that isn't just a bilateral negotiation with Ottawa?
Yeah, as a process, it was very much focused inward. It was a process that, I think was designed as much as anything to let people burn off steam. It was, a panel was appointed that included government MLAs. It included, some former associates of the party, but it wasn't designed to be a diverse cross-section of opinion in the province. The people who came to talk were not a diverse cross-section of the province. The panel tried to compensate for that to some extent, by doing some public opinion polling, but it certainly, this was not an authentic effort to just, to figure out what people were thinking in the province. This was allowing people to burn off steam. It was giving Jason Kenney some political room because of the vehemence of the view from the Wexit folks. And so, it's not surprising then, I mean, in many ways, we could predict the contents of the report before it was, the panel was formed, and it was entirely predictable. I mean, it was in some ways, it went a little bit beyond its mandate. It did talk a little bit about how to fix Confederation from, sort of a Preston Manning point of view, and he was one of the panel members. So, is that the process going forward? No, and it wasn't intended to be that. Is there a process going forward? I mean, do we, can we imagine a process in which, a cross-section of Albertans could talk to a cross-section of folks from the rest of the country? Well, that might, in fact, be an important way to engage the, engage people in a genuine dialogue, because I don't think that there was a lot of dialogue in this particular process. So, there are ways of initiating discussion. And I do think it's important for us to keep in mind, how very little Canadians know about one another at some level. We are much more attuned to north-south travel than we are to east-west travel. Some of the stereotypes that we maintain about one another across regions and cultures are pretty stunning. And we lack in some ways the understanding of some of the historical realities, or an appreciation of the historical realities that would help you engage in a conversation like this, and to understand why some of the practices that are currently in place are in fact in place.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. And just to return to the Fair Deal panel report and recommendations, it's quite evident when you read one of the 25 recommendations. Quebec already has a control over, a lot of the powers that the Fair Deal panel wants for Alberta, and I don't think that's by mistake. I suspect they're setting up the argument for negotiations. If Quebec has these powers, shouldn't Alberta get them as well? Do you align with that position? Is it just kind of, first of all, let's set aside the uniqueness of Quebec. This is not what that question is. They have a long and different history, cultural, linguistically, legally, and the like. But, there is that, opt-out provision, or Quebec is providing a lot of the services that Alberta is now asking for. You think that's legitimate, or is that just a bargaining chip or negotiation strategy?
Well, let me start by just saying that this isn't a case of Alberta getting these powers. The question is whether Alberta takes these powers, and that's a critical distinction, right?
Yeah.
These are there for the taking. Alberta can take them constitutionally, so can Prince Edward Island. And, you know, some of the things that we're talking about, other provinces have in fact taken. So, you know, you have the Ontario Provincial Police. Should we have Alberta Provincial Police, right? So it's not a question for the rest of the country. It's a question for Alberta. Is this a good plan?
Yeah.
And, you know, so there it is very much an internal conversation. And I think there's, you know, a lot to be said here. But I do think part of the dynamic behind this that I think is important to understand is a pervasive belief that Quebec has worked the system in a really successful way, that Confederation is a game and Quebec has won because it was able to muster up a credible threat of separation and, you know, therefore problems for the country, you know, existential problems for the country. And so Quebec now gets whatever it wants because it has set itself up and has played the game well. And I think that's a view that you see running all through this narrative in Alberta. And so the idea here is that if you take the same powers that Quebec has taken, then you will be accommodated in the way that Quebec has been accommodated. And so there's this sort of peculiar place that Quebec occupies in the mental imagery of this movement in Alberta. And I think that's a key dynamic. And where the whole thing falls apart is when you start thinking about the actual public policy questions that are being dealt with here. So, you know, if Alberta sets up its own police force, does that mean that the dynamics of Confederation change? No, you know, it's about a different police force. It's a minor issue for the RCMP that they'll no longer be providing contract policing. And, you know, you can even make an argument that we might be better off that way. If Alberta decides to opt out of the Canada Pension Plan, you know, and there's some process that has to take place. This isn't simply a unilateral act. But, you know, if we were to do that, would it affect the pension plan? Well, yeah, people in the rest of the country would have to pay modestly greater contributions into the plan in order to keep it sustainable. But, you know, this is not so significant. Again, it's not going to change the dynamics of Confederation. And fundamentally, what the Alberta separatist or autonomous movement wants is to change the dynamics of Confederation. And that is extraordinarily difficult to do. And I don't think that any of the tools are here.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could just jump in there, Brad.
I was going to ask you, Don.
Yeah, like I think that the whole thing about Quebec, I'm not going to repeat a lot of what Lisa said, but it certainly is true that I think Alberta has seen Quebec as extremely successful at getting its agenda on the table. And frankly, in lots of ways, that's got to be true. And so over 10 or 15 or 20 years, there's been an ongoing dialogue about shouldn't we be doing the same thing? I think that's a serious mistake. Let me set Quebec aside and just say the reason it's a serious mistake is I think that it creates up a very different dynamic in the discussion than the discussion that we actually want to have if we want to resolve the genuine grievances that are out there. And this does go back, like I think Jason Kenney's expression, a fair deal, and his claim that we want a fair deal is the right claim, right? If there are genuine grievances, let's sit down and have a conversation about it. But in order to do that, you've got to be taken seriously by the other side. That means the federal government and the people of Canada, frankly, and Albertans have to sit down and sort of say, yes, okay, we're trying to solve a problem here. But if they see you as posturing, that in fact what you're really doing is you're creating an agenda to put pressure on the rest of Canada, up to and potentially including the threat of separatism, that just works against you. It goes in the other direction. Is you lose credibility. The government can't afford, the federal government in this case, can't afford to start essentially caving in, right, to your demands. And it creates, I think it creates huge tensions. I think if there's a desire to actually seek a reconciliation, it's got to be based upon one strategy, and that strategy is fairness. It's saying, let's try to get our serious concerns on the table and let's have a conversation about them. And to go back to your question, Brad, it's critical that the federal government respond in kind. If it doesn't, then I understand people are going to get upset, and there's a whole conversation to be had about that. But combining these two strategies, trying to request and insist on a fair discussion at the same time that you're posturing and bluffing, is to play two different games that don't work together. And I do think that's a serious mistake.
Okay.
And frankly, it does seem to me that's what Alberta's doing.
Okay, let me let me take that up a level or so. I quoted at the beginning, and people will know that the measure of the separatist sentiment is on the rise, still a bit low, but it's jumped a lot in the last year. Maybe it's just a blip, but it is historically high in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Can you conceive, Don, of a point of no return? I mean, I mentioned society is very polarized now. Is there enough gas on the floor that maybe in 6 months, maybe a year or two, if we don't have these kinds of dialogues, is there a risk? And I'll ask you to respond, or a point of no return that if we don't start paying it to actively listening and paying attention?
My answer is absolutely, absolutely. I guess I hope I've made it clear. I don't think we're at the point of no return, but I'm not sure how far we are from it. And to go back to what I just said a minute ago, if Alberta plays the game of posturing and trying to raise the stakes, the sort of knife at the throat of Canada in order to make it negotiate, that is a way to actually drive us into a downward spiral. Like, I think that runs a high risk of backfiring, because people become angry and polarized, and people get they get dug into their position. So if some people in Alberta start thinking, and I appreciate this, they start thinking that the solution here is to raise the stakes by threatening separatism, at some point that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'd add one thing further too, is there's a lot of other changes at work right now. I mean, not just the climate change narrative, but globalization seems to be undergoing changes, and there may be a realignment of forces at an international level, where we find that some parts of Canada are more tied to some global forces than others, and that can make the idea of a breakup or a rupture or a point of no return even that much more possible, or that much more likely. So I guess I would say, yeah, there can be a point of no return. I don't know how far we are from there. I don't know if anybody knows, but I think we should be very careful about it. We shouldn't raise the stakes for no good reason.
So Lisa, you're in Calgary, and you see the cliff.
I can see several cliffs from where we are. And let me sketch out one of my real worries. And, in the opening remarks, I talked about how the alienation of Alberta was absolutely the alienation of the affluent, that we are paying too much into Confederation and not getting enough back out. We're bankrolling this whole thing. Well, let's assume for a moment that Alberta is about to hit hard times. And, we've already hit hard times, but I think that there is a reasonable chance that it's about to get way worse. And part of what we've seen is that political elites have taken this narrative of, the alienation of the affluent, and they've used it to whip up a sense of blame, right? That why is Alberta having hard times? Well, it's because of Ottawa. It's because of the other provinces that won't give us pipelines, and ignoring the geopolitical forces that are really driving this set of changes, right? The price of oil is not set in Ottawa. And I mean, climate change is partially an issue that's driven by Ottawa, but it's also a global movement, both of governments and of businesses. So, Alberta is facing extraordinarily difficult challenges. And if we continue to blame these challenges on Confederation, then yes, we end up in a terrible spot, to the extent that these things get way, way worse. And so I think this again points to one of the moments for intervention for the rest of Canada, right? Keep Alberta away from that economic cliff, because that is, that is where this could really get out of hand in some ways. And I mean, I think it would be quite self-destructive for Alberta to continue down this road, but we have seen some fairly alarming things over the last couple of years.
Okay, I'm going to move now to some questions from the participants. And one thing that seems to be a bit lacking, although not completely absent, is how do you see Indigenous peoples, particularly rights holders, nations in the West, Treaties 6, 8, 4, 7, the Métis, taking part in this process of a shared narrative building? But, you know, as I said, a lot of the debate seems to be the classic kind of provincial capital, Ottawa, provincial federal, you know, feud. How do we not just accommodate, but how do we have and invite Indigenous peoples and First Nations as active participants in building this shared narrative? Maybe Lisa?
Sure. I really appreciate that question because it's a critical piece of this conversation that is not being engaged in the mainstream narrative at all. And you know, I think fundamentally what we need to recognize is that this Alberta autonomist movement is, for the most part, a movement of white men. And white men who are very focused on a certain kind of economic development. Now, there have been some alliances formed with some segments of the Indigenous community in Northern Alberta. On the Fair Deal panel, there was Jason Goodstriker, who's been a sort of pro-resource development voice within the Indigenous community, who tragically died during the time that the panel was sitting. But there was no sense that this was an important part of the voices. And, you know, so much of this, of the tension that's being played out here is ignoring and silencing Indigenous people and their concerns. You know, when we talk about pipelines, there's an unspoken notion that the pipelines would happen if it weren't for the duty to consult with Indigenous communities. You know, it's seldom said, but it's just sitting there. You know, the Wexit group that talks about, you know, the unilateral separation doesn't take into account the notion that there are treaties in place that would stand in the way of this, that's simply ignored. So I think that, you know, any way forward absolutely does need to involve Indigenous communities, and that changes the conversation profoundly. So I think it's important, and I really do appreciate the question.
Okay, Don, anything to add?
Yeah, I guess what I would say is this, and I think of other processes I'm doing. For example, we're working on the design for a hospital here in Ottawa on land that is traditional lands of the Algonquins, and we're a big part of the question is we have a structured process for how we bring the public into this. And a big part of this question is how do we bring Indigenous people in who are served by the hospital? And I think there's a good analogy here. We've spent a lot of time and effort in that process talking, first of all, to the community about how they want to be involved in the process. I would take the same step, which we are doing right now, with Indigenous people. If we want to have a conversation about how we build a narrative from the bottom up, and that narrative is about Alberta's place in Confederation and Confederation's relationship to Alberta, I would ask Indigenous people how they see themselves as a part of that conversation and explain how it is we imagine this conversation taking place, and ask them how and if that's a conversation they want to be a part of. They may see that, by the way, as a conversation that should take place between Albertans and the rest of Canadians. They may not. But I think rather than having me say how I would involve them, I would go out and ask them what they think their role and their interest in this conversation is.
Okay. I'm going to combine what's behind several questions here in a moment. You know, 2020 has really been a hell of a year. I mean, with the COVID epidemic, et cetera. But what's happening now in the States and in Canada to a fair degree and in Europe about starting to listen to marginalized people and reflecting on how our various institutions have treated and ignored marginalized voices. Again, how do we have this conversation to make sure that our institutions are on a go-forward strategy or a go-forward basis are reflective of not just the dominant party in a region or nationally, but that we kind of, work toward reducing alienations of individual citizens as well as alienation of regions. Lisa, I don't know if you want to address that.
Yeah. To the extent that this is about federalism, and we've talked about, where there's room for people to engage with one another, but then governments being something of a problem. And I think that the character of the Alberta government and the character of politics in Alberta right now really does profoundly stand in the way of this. And I don't want to jump in on this in a partisan sense, but we have had an absolutely exceptional run of what would it be, the last 6 years in Alberta, where for the first time the government, in 40 odd years, the government changed. And we were governed by women, essentially, for a period of 4 years. And the experiences of those women, I think, was really telling, that they experienced threats of violence. There needed to be police outside their constituency offices. They still get these kinds of threats. And so when we talk about the way of life that's being threatened in Alberta, part of the threat is a threat of those who have typically seen themselves as being entitled to govern, and by virtue of their gender, by virtue of their ethnicity, by virtue of the industry that they work in. And so we've seen this, incredible conflict over it. And we have returned in the past year to, a government of largely, almost entirely men, and where there's some inclusion, but not a lot, and very little commitment to the idea that all voices need to be heard. So I think that, these critiques are absolutely critiques of some of this movement, and how we find our way past this in the context of Alberta is really hard to imagine.
Okay, Dawn, I'm going to go to another question from the floor. You had raised the point that climate change might be a narrative that's a unifying narrative somehow in terms of the adjustment. But isn't there also a very large risk that it could be very divisive? The questionnaire cites, look, Alberta and the West could well see themselves as regions that have to make the most effort to adapt their economies to meet national goals. It could be the most disruptive.
Yeah.
They could look at other regions like me in Toronto going, oh, so you're going to hop on a subway, but I just lost my livelihood. Does it have the, risk of being more divisive?
It's absolutely high risk. I shouldn't say it's high risk. Could this go south? Yes, it could. But here's what I would say. First of all, we're going to have the conversation about climate change one way or another. I think that's unavoidable. So it's not a choice. Do we have the conversation? What I want to say is, do we look at this as an opportunity or as a huge liability and huge risk? And I'd prefer to look at it as an opportunity. Is one way or another, the conversation with Alberta and with the oil patch and so on will happen on climate change. It has to. It's already happening. So I guess in this case, we can turn it into a virtue, or try to, by saying the real disagreement now, and I think this is great news. It's great news if the oil companies and the oil patch want to get up and say, actually, we do need to change we do need to transition to a sustainable economy. That's a big change for them. I don't know how serious they are. I think they realize their future is there. So all I would say is the real disagreement now, in principle, is not over what needs to be done. It's over how do we get there and how fast. And I would also say this is that I don't want to just go over to the environmentalist side on the sort of far side of that. We've had this discussion in the last session and assume that if they say it has to happen tomorrow, it does. I think this is where we need a very hard-headed discussion, and it's got to start and be led by at the political level. We can build a narrative potentially. We can start to open that space with the public, but that space has to line up with what's happening at the intergovernmental level and vice versa. So the answer is yes, it could all go south, but I don't think we're going to avoid this conversation. We're going to have it one way or another. So we should look at it in the best possible light.
Okay, I'm just going to throw out one more question, but before I do, someone writes in that they're very interested in getting some insights into some special techniques of building a shared narrative. Now, that's what we're in part going to be talking about tomorrow morning in the working session. But beyond doing a tutorial, Don, here, if they're participating in tomorrow's session, that's great. And if not, maybe you can give Don a call, and he's got all kinds of stuff about specific techniques and deliberative debate.
Maybe I could do a little commercial here and just say to folks out there, if you are interested in this, I work with an international group, and we're about to publish a 20-page paper on this that has, I think, a lot of the ideas sort of framed in why this is important and so on. And you'll be able to, we'll be publishing that in about 3 or 4 weeks. So if you look at my website or elsewhere, you will find it.
The following message was provided by Don Lanahan, expert in public deliberation, and he agrees with that message. Just as a final thought, and again, someone wrote this in, Lisa, you touched on it, what type of person might be best lead this debate, but is there a person, a group that can lead this discussion and debate between Alberta and Saskatchewan and the rest of Canada? Or is it just an organic kind of multivariant kind of discussion that has to happen? Is there a beacon of light on the horizon that we can look to lead these discussions? Don? Or maybe Lisa?
Okay. That is a fantastic question. And I will confess that I'm a little stumped on that one, to be honest. There are lots of voices. And one thing that I'll say is that certainly if we're looking for some degree of political leadership, we're much more likely, at least in the Alberta context, to find it in city governments than we are in provincial governments. And I think one of the reasons for that is that we haven't seen the same degree of partisan polarization that we've seen in provincial politics. I'm not as familiar with Saskatchewan, but if I think about, the big city mayors in Alberta, both of them are, potentially voices that are credible and see the way, could certainly lead a conversation like this without necessarily bringing partisan baggage to it. That having been said, I think it does speak to some of the internal cleavages between rural and urban in the province. But if I were looking for leadership, that might be my first stop.
If I could just jump in very quickly, Brad.
Absolutely.
Sorry, I was going to say this, is that when I say this needs to be led by the political level, I think that what I mean by that is the political level has to decide they want this conversation to happen. I don't think they should be out there leading it. I think they should be paying close attention and maybe speaking to the process as it's underway. But I think what you would have is a third party or third parties who are experts in this sort of thing and who can run reference panels or whatever different kind of process tools that we want to use, but so that there isn't the interference at the political level, but there is a willingness and a promise to listen and pay attention and see what comes out of it and legitimize the process. So the process itself, or a process, could be designed and could be well designed and could be carried out independently of direct political involvement, but it needs essentially the legitimacy of the politicians saying, we want this conversation to take place.
Okay.
And I would add one more thing. I think it's very much in their interest to have this conversation take place, because what probably most of them know in their heart of hearts, if not elsewhere, is that if they try to have this conversation with each other right now, it will go south very quickly. If it's going to happen and gain some ground and get some traction, it's going to start from the bottom. It's going to work from the bottom up.
Okay, great, Don. Thank you very much. Well, we're butting right up against 11 o'clock, and I'm now going to ask each of the participants, Lisa and Don, to provide 2 minutes of concluding remarks based on all we've discussed, and this will maybe set the scene for tomorrow morning. So, Lisa, can I ask you for 2 minutes of your final thoughts?
Sure. I think that something that has really been sharpened for me in the course of this conversation is the distinction between the people and the governments. And certainly partisan polarization stands in the way of having a conversation that moves us forward. Partisan polarization is strongest at the governmental level, I think, when we look at government leaders. And it is certainly played out in the population to some extent. But when we look at public opinion data, when we look at the possibility for conversations, I really do think that some sort of a process that takes this conversation out of being driven by political leaders and the political elite who are perhaps using it for their own purposes, rather than trying to find a way forward, then I do think that if there is potential, that's where it is. The second thing that I would say is just, the urgency of this conversation in some ways for Alberta and to a lesser degree Saskatchewan. When we look south of the border at some of the dynamics, some of the things that have happened as a result of industrial change away from coal not being addressed as a serious public policy issue, and the kinds of politics that you get as a result of that, that is a mistake that we want to avoid in Canada, and some kind of a way to move beyond this unproductive conversation so that we can address this and avoid that kind of a situation, I think is critically important for the Federation.
Lisa, thank you so much. Don, concluding comment.
Yeah, actually, I guess I want to sort of speak to the same idea, kind of the polarization that's out there and the challenges that are there. When I talk about a process, or when we talk about processes that are coming from the bottom up and that are relatively independent of politics like that, but that are sanctioned by government and by the minister, whoever the minister may be, the usual view is two things. One is for people to say, why would we want governments are elected to do this sort of thing. Why would we not just let them do it? Lots of governments are inclined to say that. Are we just taking away their job? That's what they were elected to do. And the second thing I think that people very often want to say is what on earth makes you think if you put a bunch of people in a room, they're actually going to agree on something? Aren't they just going to divide the same way that everybody else is? But I can tell you just from lots of experience, actually, it doesn't work that way. And let me first of all go to why it matters, why this is not taking away the politician's job. Is the time that we need these kind of processes and need to work from the bottom up to change a narrative and reshape a discussion is when for some reason, the politicians can't do it themselves. If they can do it, they don't need a process like that and they won't launch one. But what does happen increasingly for lots of reasons is there is this polarization that happens. And I honestly believe lots of politicians they'd like nothing better than to get out of that box, but they're stuck in it. They're stuck in it by the dynamic that's created out there in the media and by the opposition or whoever it is that's setting up that dichotomy, and they're paralyzed. But what we can do with a process like that is we can bring in another very legitimate, very powerful voice, citizens, right, who are not inclined to want to play that way. We know from the polling that lots of times they're quite happy to sort of say, you know what, there probably are two sides to this story, so why can't we bring it together a little bit? And we don't need them to solve all the problems. We need them to make enough progress on reshaping the storyline that then the minister is not caught in a box or the opposition party is not caught in a box, and we actually have something to run with. So in this sense, it's not taking the politician's job away, it's helping the minister get to the 30-yard line so we can pick up the ball And I think that's what I say is, it turns out that from lots of experience, people actually are quite willing to solve problems within reasonable limits. And you put them together and make them play by a fair process. I'm not saying they'll solve every problem, but we don't need them to solve all the hard problems. We need them to come down to some very basic conclusions about what is it to be a member of Confederation. Let's set some broad parameters around that. And they're actually not that bad at that when you sit down and let them have the conversation. And that means that they lots of times, more often than not, they do agree. They do want a solution. So let me just sum that up by saying the big arguments against this are almost always, why would you take away the politician's job? And the answer is you're not. This is good for the minister. And the second one is, are we going to get paralyzed in the process? And the answer is not if you design the process well. People are pretty good at solving problems.
Great. Thank you, Don. And thank you, Lisa. First order of business, I want to thank Lisa and Don for providing their insights, intelligence, and perspectives for another great chapter in the Dialogue and Debate series. And I'd like to thank all of you for participating and your great questions. We didn't get to them all, unfortunately. And of course, I'd like to thank our sponsors. And a reminder that the learning session will begin at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Now, we're going to use that learning session to deconstruct some of the narratives we talked about by distinguishing between emotions, values, and facts at play, and explore the role of risk, fear, and other motivational factors. And we'll also explore in particular how to actively listen to a narrative, which I think is particularly important to this one. And we'll assess the prospects and techniques for creating a shared narrative that could bring two sides closer together. And I hope the participant who asked that question will be joining us tomorrow. A further reminder that our final session in the Dialogue and Debate series will focus on political divisiveness and a polarized electorate. That debate will take place on Tuesday, July 21st, and the learning session will take place the following day, Wednesday, July 22nd. And we look forward to seeing many of you then. And if I don't see you or talk to you tomorrow morning, let me take this opportunity to wish everyone a fantastic Canada Day. And thank you very much for participating in the Dialogue and Debate series. Have a good day.